No se preocupe. Bueno, vamos a comenzar este evento.
We will begin this side event welcoming all of those that are here with us today from the different parts of the world. In this case, we'll give the good afternoon in Europe, good evening in Asian, and good morning in the American continent. Nevertheless, this event that is organized today is in the framework of the 49th session of the Human Rights Council. This is an event that aims to deepen what has been carried out during the 49th session of the Human Rights Council last year, where we held a similar event that was related to the rights of the indigenous people, specifically in the United States, Australia, and Canada. In this sense, this event has been organized by the permanent mission of the People's Republic of China in Geneva to the Human Rights Council and the permanent mission of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in Geneva to the Human Rights Council, co-organized and supported by the organizations of the civil society, NGOs, of the Human Rights Organization for the Social Rights and Development, and the Solidarity Committee, International Solidarity Committee. Today, this event is called the Systematic Violations of the Indigenous Peoples on behalf of the United States, Canada, and Australia. And we hold a panel of specialists in the matter, the first representatives of the various indigenous organizations of all of these countries, in this case, the United States, Canada, and Australia, and as well as with different experts on the matter that are as well representatives to in the permanent missions to the Human Rights Council. And in this event, when we want to do the presentation of a video that is entitled as How America Destroyed the Indigenous Peoples. Let's begin with this video.
When you hear the story from melody, would you think of the fate of the little Indians? Their miserable fate ensnared by an unending genocidal nightmare. With the founding of the United States of America in 1776, violence against American Indians escalated into mass atrocities. Ever since, the US government had launched over 1,500 attacks on Indians, slaughtering their people, plundering their land, and offering bounties for their scalps. The US state of California offered $5 for the severed head or scalp of an Indian. In mid-19th century, when an average American could only earn 25 cents a day.
Chivington's men actually taking the heads and scalps of women and children and parading them through the streets of Denver.
The US government applied forced sterilization to Indian women in the name of health. In the early 1970s, nearly half of Indian women of reproductive age were sterilized. As a result, many small tribes became extinct. Mass atrocities led by the US government spelled doom for the native civilization. In 1492, there had been 5 million Native Americans. By 1900, only 237,000 were left. Moreover, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 drove some 100,000 Indians to the territory west of the Mississippi River, so that white people could take over their ancestral lands. From sweltering summer heat to biting winter cold, Those Indians had to walk 60 miles a day. Pregnant women who could not keep up were shot dead. Thousands of Indians died on the way. Whereas white people celebrated the West movement, Indians mourned the Trail of Tears. By the mid-19th century, the US government had relocated most Indians to the remote and barren lands to the west of the Mississippi River, the so-called Indian reservations. In the Indian reservations, Indian children were forced into boarding schools where they were not allowed to speak their own language, wear traditional clothes, or carry out any Indian-related activities. Hungry, diseased, and abused, many children lived and died in misery.
I got hit so much I lost my tongue. I lost my native tongue. The only thing I remember was my Indian name.
We have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man.
A total of 367 such boarding schools were recorded in US history. By 1925, more than 60,000 Indian students had been sent to these so-called schools. The federal government also launched the Indian Adoption Project. Numerous Native American children were taken away from their parents and given to white families through forced adoption.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
Locked in remote territories lacking water, resources, and infrastructure, these Indian reservations were not conditioned for economic growth and soon became some of the poorest parts of America.
Did say we don't really have economic development. Here we have 2 stores, some communities don't have any.
Worse still, these reservations have become dumping grounds for toxic substances and nuclear wastes. The US government conducted 928 nuclear tests in the lands of the Shoshone tribe. These tests generated some 620,000 tons of radioactive fallout, nearly 48 times that of the atomic bombing that devastated Japan's Hiroshima. In the Navajo Nation, the largest Indian reservation in the United States, 1 in 4 women and some of their babies have in them radioactive substance in high concentrations. As a result, the locals are under much higher risk of cancer, kidney, and cardiovascular diseases, as well as birth defects.
We want clean water and clean air for our precious children and grandchildren so that they will have the same opportunity to once again play in the meadows and canyons of my childhood. Thank you.
Massacres, forced relocation, and cultural suppression against American Indians by the United States constitute a de facto genocide. Foreign policy reported that U.S. crimes against Native Americans meet the definition of genocide in every sense under the international law. It's about time the United States gave up its double standard in human rights and came clean with the world about its crimes.
And designed for the Indian to fail, to be expendable, to be eliminated.
4 little, 5 little, 6 little Indians. Yesterday, American Indians were hunted and massacred. Today, they are hurt and discriminated. The melody lingers on, and the nightmare has never ended.
Desde 1948,
Since 1948, there is the International Convention for the Convention of the Crime of Genocide. This tool of international law that codified the crime of genocide establishes in its preamble that it acknowledges that in all times of history of genocide, it has given huge losses to humanity. In this way, we establish that to constitute a genocide, we have to determine that the victims have been attacked in a deliberate manner. The Declaration of the Indigenous Peoples establishes that the indigenous peoples have the right to the collective right to live in freedom and in peace and security. And they will be not subject to genocide. So to begin this event, we want to give an opening statement to Ambassador Hector Constant Rosales, Ambassador of the Permanent Representative of the Bavarian Republic of Venezuela to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Ambassador, it is a pleasure for us to present you, and you have the floor, sir. Thank you very much. Thank all of you. It's a pleasure for us to be here amongst you and to give you the best of welcomes. We are happy to be able to exchange dialogues and ideas on this important subject ahead of us for the permanent mission of Venezuela. And clearly for the Chinese mission, it is a great honor and a pleasure to hold this sort of side events to the Human Rights Council session. It is no secret that the Venezuelan government has reivindicated the indigenous people. This video that we have just watched, in which we thank our brothers of China, it shows a terrible situation that we can think it's just a matter of the past. We know of the terrible findings in Canada of common children graveyards of indigenous children that have been found and that continue to be found for the shame of that society and of that nation, whose government pretends to be an inclusive government and that permanently pretends to give us false lessons on human rights. All of this, I would like to thank all the distinguished panelists that will honor us, Professor Alfred de Sayas, and the indigenous leaders and fighting leaders of human rights of their peoples that will take the floor one after the other to tell us their experience and to guide us and how we can do even more to end this scourge. We share a deep concern for the systematic violation of human rights of the indigenous peoples of Canada, the United States, and Australia. The case of the indigenous peoples in these countries is rooted in the colonial heritage and of European domination that has maintained in time. The indigenous communities in these countries are victims of racism, discrimination, poverty, inequality, and violence, having deep problems with the lack of decent housing, not having access to the essential services of health and education, specifically those related to the social well-being and the access to justice. All this situation is invisibilized by the great media who are at the service of political interests. They continue attacking and giving destabilizing campaigns in southern countries while they disacknowledge their own realities. They continue applying shameful unilateral coercive measures that impact populations as a whole, including the indigenous populations in our countries, but they hide the terrible realities of violations and social exclusions that they have regarding vulnerable groups in their own nations. In Venezuela, the Constitution of 1999 enshrines the rights of the indigenous peoples, recognizing their existence and their social, political, and economic organization, their use and habitudes as well, their habits and the land they inhabit. They still have challenges in having all the rights of the indigenous people, but we have greatly advanced in the recognition of the rights and honoring those rights and their historical debt that we had unfortunately ignored throughout so many years. This Bolivarian revolution has come to include, recognize, and rescue our indigenous identity, and we are proud of this. Unfortunately, this is not the same reality in the countries that we are talking about. We denounce once again the apartheid policy that is part of the peoples and communities in Canada, United States, and Australia. They are violating their human rights through to taking them out without an unlawful way, and that comes to their desperation as original people, violating their elemental and fundamental rights. We hope that this important event complies with the goals and aspirations, giving information and fostering the continuous struggle for the rights of our ancestral peoples, specifically of the indigenous peoples of Canada, the United States, and Australia. I thank you, and let's hope that this is a fruitful dialogue and an enriching dialogue for all of us here present. Thank you very much, Ambassador, once again for your participation in this event held within the framework of the 49th session of the Human Rights Council. Your collaboration has always been very important and meaningful to the development and to clarify of what has been the human rights of the indigenous peoples in the United States, Canada, and Australia, specifically in general of the defense of human rights of peoples in the world. So please, you have our great gratitude for participating in this event. To continue with this side event, we would like to welcome and the opening statements on behalf of the Minister of the Permanent Mission of the People's Republic of China to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, Mr. Yang Duan. Minister, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator. Excellency Ambassador Rosales, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this online seminar on systemic violations of indigenous people's rights by the US, Canada, and Australia, co-hosted by the Permanent Mission of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and the Permanent Mission of China on the sideline of the 49th session of the Human Rights Council. As Ambassador Rosales pointed out, and as we saw from the video a moment ago, the United States, by means of killings, displacement, and forced assimilation, has systematically deprived American Indians of their basic rights, including the right to life, their political, economic, and cultural rights, as they attempted to physically and culturally eradicate this entire community. We might recall from the video that the Native Indian population plummeted from around 5 million at the end of the 15th century to only 237,000 at the beginning of the last century. And many tribes literally became extinct. On March the 2nd, the Chinese government made public. In fact, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs published the American Genocide of the Indians, Historical Facts and Real Evidence. And I honestly refer you to this dossier to know more about this background. Since the beginning of last year, there has been shocking and depressing discovery of a large number of unmarked, unmanned graves where remains of indigenous children in Canada were found. And to this day, the entire truth remains untangled. Australia has also in history pursued the notorious White Australia policy, under which 100,000 Aboriginal children were taken away by force from their families, causing lifetime harm and trauma to this stolen generation. Serious violations of Indigenous peoples' rights by the United States, Canada, and Australia are not just something of the past. More importantly, it is a matter of chronic and systemic racism that continues to this day. Today, Indigenous peoples are still subject to widespread and systemic discrimination and inequality in these countries. And they are marginalized and left at the bottom of the society, politically, economically, and culturally. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated their dire and disadvantageous situation. The United States, Canada, and Australia, therefore, are advised and urged to reflect on what they have done to the Indigenous people and immediately amend laws and change policies that violate Indigenous people's rights and investigate the crimes and hold the perpetrators accountable. They should uproot the pernicious legacies of colonialism, eradicate systemic racism and discrimination to ensure the equality and rights of the Indigenous peoples. And multilateral human rights bodies such as the Human Rights Council and the OHCHR should take actions on serious violations of Indigenous peoples' rights in the above-mentioned countries. It is hoped that this meeting will help raise the awareness of systemic violations of the rights of Indigenous peoples in these countries so that eventually justice and truth will prevail for the Indigenous peoples. I wish this side event complete success and rewarding for all of us. Thank you.
Agradecemos, por supuesto, al ministro Jim Duan.
We thank the Minister Jim Duan for the Permanent Mission of the People's Republic of China for your words and important reflections to deepen in this subject that is of quite importance of the rights of the Indigenous peoples in Australia, Canada, and specifically in the United States. Nevertheless, it's a great effort made by the People's Republic of China to make this fact visible that vis-a-vis the different media, in the case of the United States, 5 million have natives that currently have no rights. We want to continue with our event, and we are honored and pleased to welcome the various panelists that will accompany us today in this side event. And we would like to give the warmest of welcomes of one of the colleagues that have been taking part of this in an active manner in the defense of human rights, specifically in this subject, Mr. Alfred de Salles, who is a former independent expert of the United Nations on the protection and promotion of a democratic and equitable international order. He's going to accompany us through a video through which we would like to welcome, and we ask the technical team that is helping us to please put this video of Alfred on screen.
Good day. I'm Alfred Desires. I was United Nations Independent Expert on International Order, 2012 to 2018. I presented 14 reports, 13 thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly, and one country report. My reports are reflected in this book that I published in 2021, Building a Just World Order. Back in 1970, when I was still at Harvard, I decided to hitchhike from New York to California and back. And I had the experience of discovering tens of thousands of names of towns and cities and rivers and mountains and lakes, all indigenous. And I asked myself already then, where are these people? Of course, we know that there are reservations or concentration camps where you keep the Navajos or the Sioux or the Pueblos away from the rest of society. But what happened to the rest of them? Because demographic studies about the Americas at the time of Christopher Columbus indicated that there were estimated 10 million indigenous, the Pequots and the Seminoles and the Crees and the Cherokees, north of the Rio Grande, the territory that today is the United States of America and Canada. And in Central America, Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, etc., and in South America, there were an estimated 70 million. Now, in America, they very nearly disappeared, which is not the case in Latin America. In Latin America, you still have a vibrant indigenous population, whether we're talking about the 1 million Mapuches in Chile and Argentina, or you're talking about the Quechuas and others in Ecuador and in Peru and in Paraguay, etc. Now, coming to the North American continent and what happened to those 10 million indigenous. Obviously, many died of disease. I mean, that is the excuse that you get in history books. Ah, what a pity, they all died of smallpox because they didn't have the antibodies against European germs. Well, surely a great many did die of smallpox, and sometimes deliberately. I mean, there is proof that General Amherst did use a kind of biological warfare against the indigenous in Massachusetts. But let us now concentrate on the treaties. The indigenous made treaties with the Crown, made treaties with the colonies, with the original 13 colonies of the United States. But these treaties were broken almost as soon as they were made. No sooner did the indigenous agreed to let the European settlers come to a certain border that the greed of the American settlers wanted always more. And eventually it was manifest destiny. Eventually it was the idea of conquering the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Caribbean to the Bering Straits, etc. Now, you would think that American history books would devote a certain amount of space to the First Nations of the continent. After all, I mean, 10 million is a lot of people, and they actually covered the entire continent. And what happened? Because when I was a student in high school in Chicago, I never heard about any of this. I mean, of course, we had comic books, and we had our movies, cowboys and Indians, and of course the cowboys were the good guys and the Indians were the bad guys. That's quite clear. But I discovered a book by Martin Luther King Jr., a book that has been largely ignored, a book that you don't see cited in the mainstream media. The book is entitled Why We Can't Wait, a book published in 1964, and Martin Luther King is focusing primarily on the injustices, slavery, segregation, discrimination against the Afro-Americans. But then, and here is a photocopy of the cover page of Why We Can't Wait. Allow me to read from page 120, because it is significant that Martin Luther King would write these words. They're pretty tough. I quote, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race, even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores. The scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalted." End of quote. I could go on and on reading from it because it is pretty shocking what he's writing here. And I published that in October 2020 in the staff magazine of the United Nations, the New Special. I published that quote, but it's a fairly long article on perceptions of history on the discovery of America. As I became more interested in the subject matter, I looked at the gradual acknowledgement by governments that some kind of injustice was done to the indigenous. It's interesting to note that in December 2009, President Barack Obama actually issued an apology to the American indigenous, to the First Nations. And it's like a tree fell in the forest and nobody heard it. It's something that was absolutely kept out of the mainstream media, and it's hidden in a resolution of the US Congress. So in this sense, I thank you for the opportunity of saying these few words, and I wish you a successful conference.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation of this video. Alfred, in a positive way, has sent us this video in order to provide to the subject that we are dwelling here today regarding the human rights of the indigenous peoples. And to continue with today's program, we would like to give a warm welcome to Professor Tian Li, who is a professor, associate professor of the University of Shandong. It's important to mention that he has a PhD in law by the Faculty of Law in the University of Vienna, Austria, and he currently works in the law faculty of Shandong. And his interest of investigation include the basic theory of international law and the resolution of international conflict, the international right of human rights, and international humanitarian rights. So Professor Tian Li, he allows us to present, and we want to give him the warmest of welcomes to the development of this side event. Would you please be so kind as to unmute yourself, sir?
Thank you, moderator. Can you hear me clearly?
Perfecto, le escuchamos.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, perfectly.
Your Excellency John and Rosalise, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As the first part of my presentation, I intended to briefly introduce to you the tragic history of American Indians in the United States. But after having just watched the documentary, I decided not to dwell on this part because of the shocking effect and the persuasive power of this documentary. As depicted in this documentary, it was until the 1970s that the academic community began to use the term genocide to denounce US policies toward American Indians. And for a long time, the US government has been hesitant to acknowledge the historical wrongs inflicted upon indigenous peoples and confront systematic barriers that prevent the full realization of indigenous peoples' rights. On the other hand, the US position on what constitutes the shadow for genocide is very vague, and sometimes arbitrary and capricious statements can be found when the US targeted other countries and regions, such as cases in former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Darfur, and China. At this point, one cannot help but wonder, isn't this being disciplined to others and treating himself with leniency a double standard approach? I tried to look for clues in some of the US interactions with international law, particularly international human rights law, to explore why this situation exists. In fact, the United States is not as enthusiastic about international human rights law as one might think, despite the fact that the US may have always considered itself the beacon of light in this respect. Thus far, the United States only ratifies 4 human rights core treaties. They are the Genocide Convention, International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Convention Against Torture, and the 2 optional protocols to the Conventions on the Rights of Child. All of these treaties or conventions contain provisions on indigenous rights to a greater or lesser extent. For even that, these treaties conventions are defined by the US laws as not self-executing, thus being just judicially unenforceable in the United States. Take the Genocide Convention for an example. The United States signed the Genocide Convention 2 days after its adoption by the General Assembly in 1948, but did not ratify it until 1988. After then, President Reagan signed the Genocide Convention Implementation Act, making genocide a federal crime under US law. In fact, this convention can play the role no more than as interpretive guides for the US laws. More noteworthy is that this act, to some extent, condemns the impunity phenomenon. On the face of it, this act prevents the US from persecuting foreign nationals who commit acts of genocide abroad and later come to the US. In other words, the US law leaves no room for the exercise of universal jurisdiction over genocide. But the true purpose of this act is to, through the territoriality and the nationality principles, protect its own nationals against foreign persecutions when they commit genocide in the US or abroad. In addition, multiple conditions, namely reservations, understandings, and interpretive declarations are attached to these treaties. Using the Genocide Convention again as an example, the US declared a reservation to Article 5 of this convention, which stipulates the obligations of enactment or legislation of the contracting parties. However, in the view of the US government, nothing in the convention requires or authorizes legislation or other action by the US prohibited by the US Constitution as interpreted by it. The US is a federal bicameral state. Thus, the federal government lacks constitutional power to legislate in the area of criminal law, or where an executive government which signs a treaty cannot secure the passage of legislation through the upper house or through cooperative arrangements with subnational governments. This reservation is not compatible with general international law, which does not allow states to plead internal law to excuse non-compliance with the obligations under the convention, or signal a general lack of acceptance of any attempt to create a constitutional cover-out. This is also the legal rationale for the objections that the US reservation received from many other contracting parties. Moreover, the United States also declined to accept any individual complaint communication procedures within the UN Human Rights Charter or treaty-based bodies, or closes referring disputes under the treaties or conventions to the International Court of Justice. Now, let's back to the situation of indigenous people in the US today. At the UN level, for the past decade, many of the recommendations made by the two consecutive special rapporteurs on the rights of indigenous people yet to be realized. Similar observations can be found in the subsequent report released by the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights in 2018. The report specifically mentions indigenous people. Indigenous peoples as a group, quoted, suffer disproportionately from multidimensional poverty and social exclusion, ranging from poverty and unemployment rate, social protection for children, physical and psychological health status, and etc. The report concludes that the US government has failed in entering a trust relationship with recognized tribes which are eligible for funding and services from Bureau of Indian Affairs. Nevertheless, to date, these problems have never been properly addressed. More recently, the UN human rights experts have called on the US to halt and planned the imminent forced evictions of 63 people who self-identify as belonging to the Massacres indigenous tribe in northern Washington state. These people have lived there under the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. If this is the case for federal or state recognized native tribes, what is the situation for those non-recognized tribes? There are over 400 such tribes in the United States. This means not only that they are living without any benefit from the federal or state program, but also the data for these tribes would have not been collected by the US government. It is hard to imagine their situations being addressed properly in a country where evidence-based policy making is the norm. As a result, people belonging to these tribes are disempowered, live in a context in which their way of life is not legally protected. To solve these problems, the US faces at least 3 serious obstacles. The first obstacle is the US rejection of treaty norms of reasons that many US human rights lawyers would applaud. For example, when CERD requires criminalization of all dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority or hatred, when ICCPR bans all advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement or discrimination, hostility, or violence, the US declared reservations to these provisions on First Amendment grounds. Many UN human rights lawyers even supports the US position to allow hate speech that falls short of such incitement. The second obstacle is US rejection of treaty norms for reasons deeply embedded in US legal and political culture. The Supreme Court's rejection of CERD's committee's calls for the US to redefine racial discrimination across the board in order to meet CERD's purpose or effects definition serves as another good example. The further obstacles can be expressed as US violations of treaty norms, even where they are consistent with American culture and values. In these areas, including the rights of the indigenous people, of course, the US should live up its international commitments without any delay. Finally, I had to make a pessimistic conclusion. Given that these three obstacles are deeply rooted in the American legal and political system, no possibility exists for them to be overcome. Here's my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Profesor Tianli, le agradecemos. En primer
Professor
lugar,
Tianli, we thank you for your content, for your important content that you have provided to deepen this subject and to qualify this and what we are talking here, and we thank you for complying with established times for all the panelists. And we hope to continue working together next time in these sorts of activities related to the defense of human rights of indigenous peoples and in general the defense of human rights. To continue developing our program, we want to invite the representative of the indigenous communities in Canada, Commisette Leffert. Seth was participating in the previous side event within the framework of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. He is originally from Canada, from Mohawk. He has led various encounters and manifestations on behalf of the indigenous peoples in the North American country. Undoubtedly, Seth is one of those important social leaders that represent the indigenous peoples that is leading the battles that they are still fighting in Canada. So we would like to give him the warmest of welcomes. Seth, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. I would like to offer my softest and kindest words of gratitude and thanking all of you for making this side event happen and to begin to talk about the kind of genocide that Indigenous people in Canada and the United States and Australia have faced. And I'm hopeful that this leads towards charges of genocide against all three of these countries, and that we seek to find solutions. So I understand that today's discussion is to be focused around the data and the kinds of what happened here in these places. So I'll speak to that a little bit, but it's a painful topic for me. Oftentimes we talk about these sort of issues as if they happened in the past. Canada is particular, likes to pretend that it's a human rights advocate and it's a defender of good, but it's in fact not the case. I think the most important thing to focus on or to think about as we begin to have a discussion about genocide, and particularly what's occurred in Canada, we have to ask the question, why? Why did Canada seek to eradicate several hundred Indigenous nations across the Americas or across Canada? It's common to refer to Indigenous nations as tribes because in international law, in the past, tribes didn't have as much power or as much rights as nations did. But I implore you to consider the fact that when the Crown and when England and when France and Germany and Denmark came to the shores of North America, they made treaties with nations. not with like roving bands of people running around in the bushes, but established nations with established borders and established lands, with political systems and economic systems and education systems and so on, with unique and powerful militaries and economies and culture. And so what we're talking about is the eradication of that. And the question is, why? Why did Canada choose to do that? Why did the United States try to choose to do that? And the reason is very simple. Because they wanted the land and they wanted access to the resources so that they could take those resources and sell them throughout the world or transform them into a product that could be sold. So Canada's primary economy is built off of the extraction of resources that are sold throughout the world. They sell iron ore, they sell gold, they sell diamonds, oil, timber, fish, salt, all sorts of things. All of these natural resources are resources of Indigenous people, of their territory and their lands. And because the European countries that came here made treaty relationships, treaties are agreements that are made between nations. They're not made between a nation and its citizens. You don't make treaties like that. So what's happening in Canada is that Canada has been actively working at trying to force assimilation. I heard some interesting things in the last few months or month or so with what's happening with Yugoslavia and Russia and the sanctions that the United States and Canada put on Russia and that sort of thing. And I thought to myself, that's very interesting because that's exactly what they did to us. They sanctioned us in every single way. We're literally the most sanctioned people in the world because we're not even allowed to have relationships and build relationships and do it and trade with other nations in the world. We're not even allowed to trade with other Indigenous nations in other countries, like in the United States, where we've had a relationship for thousands of years. They block our ability to do that. In fact, sanctioned so much so that Canada doesn't recognize our brothers and sisters of our own nations, because many of us, like my people, the Mohawks, we call ourselves the Ganenga, the people of the land of the Flint. And we were the first people one of the first people to experience the onslaught of genocide from the American government after the American Revolution. We actually were actively participated in the American Revolution as when the United States split away from Britain. They tried to take our land first, my people's land first, in New York State, and so we joined in the battle to protect our lands. And United States and Britain made a treaty, and our friend here who was just speaking about international law, it's one of the basis of international law is these original treaties. And they made an agreement and they passed a border. They drew a borderline between Canada and the US that never existed before. And they did that in the 1700s. And it left us out. And so we've been struggling since the 1700s with many of our people living on one side of that border and many of our people living on the other side of that border, not even being able to do trade and to freely work with ourselves. In fact, one of our communities has the border running right through the center of it, and the people have to check in every day to go home, and then check in with the border patrol to go to work, or check in, they go to groceries. They're constantly being harassed and asked questions about where they're going and who they are and all those sort of things. This is the sort of experience that we've had. When Canada was first formed as a country, they needed land because they didn't have hardly any land. It didn't really exist because the majority of the land was Indigenous lands, and it was recognized and understood as our own countries, our own borders, and we governed ourselves. We weren't like nomadic tribes of people roaming around, lost. We had complex and complicated agreements between ourselves about how we manage our territories. And so Canada, what they did was they created something called the Indian Lands Act, and they rounded us up and they put us in these little pockets, little reserves. And then they offered us the opportunity to give up our rights as Indigenous people and join them. And majority of us didn't do that. And so what they did then was they took over our schools. Many of our nations, my people, and the nations around us, we had already established our own schooling system. We had the first public schools in Canada. And so what they did was they created what they call the residential schools, or the Indian day schools. And many people don't talk about the Indian day schools. They're very similar. One school, the kids were taken away and forced to go to those schools. And the other school, the kids were still forced to go to the school, but they went home at nighttime. That was the difference. And so they started with these, actually they started with what they call manual labor schools. And my first wife, her community had the first manual labor school. They literally made schools where they would teach, forest Indian kids, Indigenous kids, to learn how to do manual labor, so that they would be the work. They could use them as a workforce for Canadian society. And so their plan initially was that we would be basically the slaves and the workers, the slugging rocks and moving bricks and so on for them. Well, that didn't work, and so they actively began to work at trying to eradicate our language and our cultures, so that they could erase our memory of who we are and erase our relationship to our lands, because they wanted our lands for the resources. And that is continuing today. So during the Geneva Convention on Human Rights, all of you are welcome to look this up. Canada refused to sign the Human Rights Convention, on the basis that there was one of the criteria on that list that was considered genocide was cultural genocide, and Canada refused to sign the declaration until cultural genocide was removed from the list. And the reason was because they were fully aware at that time in the early 1900s that they were in full-scale cultural genocide, eradicating our languages and our way of life and our way of thinking, so they could take us from the land and force assimilate us. And that forced assimilation is a part of the reason why we have so many sanctions against us, that we're not able to have economic relations outside of, we're not allowed to have economic relations outside of them. The British Crown ordered in I think it was 1763, the Royal Proclamation. And they said that this all North America was for their use only, and no other European or other countries, nations could come here and have a relationship or do business or do anything here. That the King of England was the one completely in power, and that is why everything is related to the crown. The crown. Even the United States was that way until they had their revolution, and I believe that Australia is the same. And so what happened was, we have been in a perpetual state of being sanctioned to not be able to have any relationships outside of the Americas. We're very privileged and very lucky that I actually personally got to speak with the ambassador of Venezuela. There was an ambassador of Venezuela to Canada, and he came and met with my people, and it was a historic moment, and it was beautiful. And we got to become friends, and we miss him. He came a few times and we visited. But that was one of the very few times that opportunity has occurred for us. And Canadian government wasn't happy that happened. And so we've been held in this state of poverty. The first Prime Minister made a policy that and it can be looked up easily, that he that it was of his mind to starve us. So they rounded us up and they put us in open air concentration camps called Indian reserves. I'm currently in one right now. And they still exist. They're still fully happening and functional. And they rounded us up and they put us on those. And then they cleared the land, and then they just poured the settlers on the land, and they opened up the gates and said, you know, brought people from Ireland and from England and Scotland and Germany and Denmark and France and everywhere, and filled our lands and our country with people that they basically gave our land away to, on the condition that they would pay taxes to the crown. Because all of our treaties, we are not obligated or responsible to pay any taxes to the crown, because we're not a part of the crown, we're separate. And so they wanted to get rid of us so they could do that. And so that's what's been going on. All of the things in the movie that you've seen, it was very good. I'm very thankful that the Chinese government or whoever built that, put that together, because it's very, very good in terms of what transpired. The same things happened in Canada: forced assimilation, the theft of our children. So in Canada, they made it legally requirement that all of our kids go to their schools. And that still is the case. I was looking it up on the internet a little while ago, and it was saying the residential schools, the forced going to their schools that ended in 1947. Well, that's not true. The last residential schools closed in 1996, and the last Indian day schools, there actually are a couple still functioning. They're still running today. There's one in the community where I live, and it's ran by the federal government of Canada, and it's an Indian day school. That's what I went to, was Indian day school, and the purpose was to eradicate our language. So they make these. They wrote in their constitution in 1985 that section that they said they enshrined our Aboriginal rights, our inherent rights, that they can't be taken away from or destroyed or gotten rid of. But then they never just defined what they were, and so they arrest us and drag us away and do all kinds of horrible things to us. And then when we try to defend ourselves and say, well, we have the right to do that, they say, well, prove it. And then they force us to go, excuse me, into their court system, drag us into their court system, even though we're a separate people, force us into their court system. And then they generally beat us by attrition because we're too poor to fight the extreme costs. And the Canadian government will go to go no ends, like they won't stop to win their case. They'll steal our land, and then we'll take them to court, and they'll drag it out for 30 years. That happens in Canada. And this is the sort of thing that occurs all the time. I'm currently have charges against me that I'm carrying for several years now, and expect further, where they're claiming that I disrupted their access to their property when it's our land. So these are the sort of things that we're experiencing. So many of you are, I'm sure, curious to know about the residential school unmarked graves. So imagine anywhere else in the world, there are graveyards in the schoolyards. Let that sink in. And they did not mark them graves. They didn't even tell the parents their children died. They killed the children is what they did. Because the objective of those schools was not to educate, but to eradicate our life, our way of life, and our way of thinking, and our languages, so that they could force our assimilation, which is it's an act of genocide. And they eradicate our languages on purposeful, because our knowledge about our land is in there. And so when the children that wouldn't break, that they couldn't force to speak English, that resisted them when they took away their names and gave them new ones, because that all happened. When they forced them to be someone else than who they were, they died. They killed them. Or they created scenarios where, and they even had reports, Canada had reports, there was reports written to them by doctors who went and investigated the schools and were like, there's poor ventilation, they're not getting enough nutrition, they're into too small of buildings, and the cause is it's spreading tuberculosis and other diseases. and is killing these kids. And the government did nothing. In fact, they kept it going and put more money into building more of the same kind of thing. They didn't fix it. It was on purpose. It was on purpose. They purposely tried to kill us all so they could take our land, take our resources, and sell it to places like China. That's what they're doing. And that's continuing today. And they, even when they're forced and faced with the fact that they don't own the land, that they don't have a treaty in a particular area, and so they don't have any right to go there to do anything, their constitution says so, they'll just simply go in with militarized police instead of the army, because if they do militarized police, the rest of the international world ignores it, or maybe is not able to intervene, and then they just increase the scale of violence until the indigenous population is too afraid to fight back because they know that they'll result in our murder. And there's so few of us left. They just threaten us with murder by they bringing in weapons and assault rifles and sniper teams and gas and all these sort of things. And we're not able to resist them because we know the consequences. In the past, when we resisted them with firearms, they brought the army or they killed us. Dudley George was a man. He was resisting. They were trying to protect their land, and the Ontario Provincial Police killed him. These are the sort of experiences that we have. This is what we're living with today. I live in this community, and I want to build a house, a home, but I can't get a loan to get a house because we can't get banking. They have blocked us from being able to have banks. Some of my people have went to seek to set up banks, like building relationships with other places in the world, because Canada won't allow us to have our own banking system, and they block us from being able to borrow any money to business development or housing development and those sort of things in our own communities on these little concentration camps. And they completely block us and refuse to recognize our right to our land off of the reservation, because we have huge tracts of land that are ours, originally ours, and that we have treaties for, and that it's our land, and they're piled full of settlers.
Seth, disculpa. No quisiera interrumpir.
Seth, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt your extraordinary intervention, but we also have other panelists that need to take the floor. So we ask you if you can have a minute to wrap up your ideas. Thank you very much, and we apologize for cutting you off.
No problem. I'm not sure. It's such a huge issue to talk about, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak a bit. And I would like the opportunity to speak more. It's well, we need to look at our solutions. We need the opportunity to be able to leave Canada and the United States and be independent. And I would encourage you other countries to consider how you could help us, financial aid, military support, these sort of things, because we're literally in fighting for our lives. So thank you very much, and I hope that there's fruit coming of this. Have a great day. I look forward to hearing what everybody else has to say.
Muchísimas gracias, Seth, por
Thank you very much, Seth, for your reflection, because it's also the living experience of the struggle of an important leader of the Indigenous peoples in Canada who has suffered in his own skin what has been the facts through which the direction of the Canadian government has denied these fundamental rights of the Indigenous peoples in this country. To continue with our program, we are honored to present an important panelist who is also representative of the Indigenous peoples, but in this case from Australia. This is Mr. Ray Minicon. He is an ancient statistic Indigenous and comes from the Kabi Kabi Nation and from the Guran Nation from the southeast of Queensland. In 1995, he made a statement before the United Nations in Geneva on behalf of the Indigenous peoples of what was the first answer of the rights of Indigenous peoples. Mr. Ray Minicum, it's a pleasure to have you here amongst us. in this important side event. We wish to give you the warmest of welcome, and you have the floor, sir.
Ambassador Hector, Constant, and the ambassador for the permanent mission to China. I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of my people. Thank you also, Gabriel, for co-hosting this particular evening tonight, and David for the invitation to speak tonight. I try to speak on behalf of my ancestors. I want to try to be the voice of my ancestors who have faced some of the most brutal crimes in the history of our people and our nation. Similar crimes to that you've heard already tonight from the United States as well as from Canada and other Indigenous nations across the globe. But before I do, I just want to make 4 declarations on behalf of all Indigenous peoples. The first one is this, that I want to declare that all Indigenous peoples are entitled, as against the whole world, to possession, occupation, use, and enjoyment of the lands of their ancestors. 2, I want to declare that all Indigenous peoples are not outsiders or foreigners in their own lands. They are the descendants of the first peoples of their country, the original inhabitants, and they are to be recognized as such. 3, I want to declare that none of the events of invasion, settlement, federation, or the advent of foreign citizenship laws have displaced the unique position of Indigenous peoples with their lands. And 4, I want to declare that Indigenous peoples have a unique connection to their country. It is not just ancestry or place of birth or even both. Indigenous peoples have a connection with the land, waters, and skies under Indigenous laws and customs. No imposed citizenship act has removed or modified that connection. No parliament or foreign government has removed or modified that connection by any other laws or any other legislation. We are the sovereign owners of our own territories here in this particular country, as well as in other countries. So thank you for talking about genocide in my country. I started off tonight with the convention, the UN Convention on Genocide. And it's Article 2 that is of great interest to us tonight, because Article 2 of the convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. As such, A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And C, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And as you've heard tonight, whether it's here in Australia, or whether in Canada, or whether in the United States, or even in other colonized countries like New Zealand, for example, amongst the Maori people, those 5 articles within that convention, we have suffered every one of those. And so this convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide has not been directed to or even looked at in terms of the International Court on behalf of my people or the Canadian Aboriginal people or Native Americans. In my country here, we have just given a gift to the nation called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And it's the largest consensus of First Nations peoples on a proposal for substantive recognition in Australian history, which call for 3 important matters to be considered. Number 1, a voice. We don't have a voice. We don't even have a seat at the table. Number 2 is truth-telling. We need to tell the truth about our country and how our Indigenous peoples have been treated here in this country here. And 3, we as Indigenous Australians are looking for a treaty. We're the only Indigenous peoples on the planet colonized by foreigners who do not have a treaty, because we came under a doctrine called terra nullius. And terra nullius simply means land belonging to nobody, or nobody's land. Even though we might have thrown spears at Captain Cook and a few others, we were still looked upon as not a part of the human race. We looked down upon, and we were described in that particular way. We were, in terms of the many theories that were going around, the social theories, particularly social Darwinism, it was as if they had found the missing link between themselves and some little microbe in a lake. And we were treated as such. We were treated as nothing and no one, because this land here, nobody inhabited it. In spite of the fact that this particular country, Australia, has been populated by over 700 different nation groups. And as our brother Philippe has described, I'm from the Kabi Kabi people on my father's side, Gurung Gurung on my mother's side. That's who I am. That's where I come from. That's my rivers, that's my mountains, that's my ancestors. They gave us that land. They passed it on to me. It's my inheritance, nobody else's. And so we are asking for a voice, a seat at the table. And this is a very important part of what we are asking for. Not only a seat at the table here in our own country, but as you can see at the United Nations level, which is represented here tonight, every one of those countries that have been mentioned, the US, Canada, Australia, they all sit at either the G7 or the G10 or the G20. They're making decisions about my people and my country, but we don't have a seat at that table either. And so we are being abused and misused, as well as marginalized and sidelined because of the invasion of our people. So First Peoples, like I mentioned before, have lived and cared for the land and its people in Australia for over 60,000 years. And yet our voice has been silenced since 1788. And the First Nations voice to Parliament is needed right now, which needs to be enshrined in the Australian Constitution. And we also want that voice to demand a constitutional right to self-determination over our own lands and over our people and over our own future. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh. The other thing we want to, as a part of that, is a Makarrata commission is a truth commission. Makarrata means making, healing the wounds that have been created through violence. And so in First Nations culture, healing after a conflict can only begin with a process of truth-telling. This is what a Makarrata is about. It's a truth commission. A truth commission will investigate and expose the true history of the crimes and injustices committed against First Peoples, which continue to result in traumatic experiences by our people since the invasion and colonization of our country since 1788. Now, if you look at Canada, for example, they have had a truth commission. You look at South Africa, they too have had a truth commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We haven't had that experience, nor have we been offered that kind of opportunity up until this particular time in our story. And we're still asking for that. We want the truth to be exposed in our country. We cannot let that lie down. And the fourth thing we want is a treaty. We're the only, like I mentioned before, we're the only indigenous nation on the planet that don't have a treaty with their colonizers. And so we are still under this notion of terra nullius. We do not exist. And that treaty we want is to give recognition of First Peoples sovereignty. No treaty has ever been negotiated between First Nation sovereign peoples and the Australian government. And a treaty must include a Bill of Rights, which goes to the heart of some of our deepest concerns. We want land rights. We want veto powers over mineral and other resources. We want health rights. Health rights just not only for the people, but for the land itself, our waters, our mountains, our food rights, our sea rights. All of those rights must be a part of the treaty process. We want recognition also of our ancient customary laws, which were good laws. Our laws were very good laws. It kept us for 60,000 years on this land here, living in luxury. We want education rights. We want housing rights. Our houses are full of people. The overcrowding of our houses and the condition and state of our housing in many of our communities is appalling. So we want housing rights and basic human freedoms, those human freedoms that are enshrined in the UN Charter. Next slide. We've experienced massacres, many massacres of First Nations tribes in our country. They've been wiped out. These massacres, similar to the ones that you saw in the video clip from First Nations peoples, similar things have happened here to our people. And so just recently, as recent as this month, on the 16th of the 3rd of this month, the Guardian newspaper put this article together and said, look, frontier massacres in Australia increased as colonial forces moved across the nation, with new data concluding at least 11,000 Indigenous peoples were killed in 416 massacres between 1780 and 1930. And we've seen some more recent massacres. I have sat at the feet of some of our old people who have run away because of massacres, and they're still in our memory. So this is 2022. I've heard these stories just only in the last 1990s of last century. And so we're still facing these kind of traumas that are still a part of the things that we feel and experience on a day-to-day basis. The other thing that we're experiencing also that for me is a part of the process of genocide is the ways in which the incarceration rates of First Nations peoples. And although First Nations adults make up only about 2% of the national population, perhaps 3%, we constitute 27% of the national prison population. 27% of our people are in jail. And First Nations peoples were 17.3 times more likely to be arrested than non-Indigenous peoples. And First Nations peoples are massively overrepresented in the criminal justice system of Australia. They represent only 2 to 3% of the total population, yet more than 27 to 29% of Australia's prison population are people from my particular nation, First Nations peoples. But not only that, those particular stats, this is another alarming fact for me. It really does go deep into the heart of my emotions and makes me weep nearly every day of my life. But our youth detention, half of all young people held in detention facilities in Australia are First Nations youth. 2/3 have yet to be sentenced for a crime, and those crimes are so menial that it's just not worth being arrested for. And the over-incarceration of First Nations youth is one of our nation's most significant human rights concerns and abuses. In just 1 year across Australia, close to 600 First Nations children aged 10 to 13 years were locked up, and thousands more were hauled through the criminal and legal system. And so First Nations children are disproportionately impacted by these laws and punished into or locked into prisons.
Disculpe, señor Rey Minicon, no quisiera interrumpir.
Sorry, I wouldn't like to interrupt your extraordinary intervention, but we have to finish off your remarks because we have other panelists as well. So if we ask you to please finish your remarks, thank you very much, and we apologize.
Family violence that we face in our communities is quite another human rights issue, and climate change is one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now as Indigenous peoples. I'll stop there. I mean, there's so many other parts of this story that needs to be highlighted, but there was one part there that I mentioned at the end, and we need to revisit this Genocide Convention. And one of the things that I feel is that a new definition of genocide must be attempted to be written by the victims of genocide and not by someone who has not experienced genocide, because genocide is still very active in our own lifetimes, and genocide studies need to be encouraged. So this crime against the world's most marginalized and vulnerable people must be stopped. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. I'll end there. Thank you.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ray Minicon. It's been a pleasure to hear you based on all of your experience of struggle of the indigenous peoples in Australia. And to continue with our program, we would like to give the warmest of welcome on the special lawyer of indigenous people and researchers of the Sures organization, Eric Gutierrez, who accompanies us from Venezuela in this event within the framework of the 49th session of the Human Rights Council. Eddie, welcome. Eric, welcome. It's a pleasure. Welcome. Can you hear me? Yes, perfectly. Greetings to all here present from the Human Rights Organization Sures in Venezuela. So my presentation is to the identification of the First Nations in Australia, Canada, and the United States. I'm going to start with Australia. They showed their support of the Declaration of the United Nations of the Indigenous Peoples. To honor this, Australia needs to develop a national action plan to implement the declaration, translating its provisions into laws and policies. It has to be a national body, translating its provisions into the Human Rights Declarations Act to the laws, policies, and practices, including it in the Human Rights Act, as well as creating an independent body to oversee its implementation in consultation with the Aboriginal of Torres Strait Islander peoples. Likewise, it's important to highlight that Australia has not signed the ILO Convention number 169 on Indigenous and Tribal peoples, which they should be committed to, since they should have the will to apply this declaration. So it's important to review at a national level, subscribing and applying Convention 169 of ILO on regarding the rights of Indigenous people. We also recommend that Australia probably review its constitution to recognize Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' rights, consistent with the call made with the Uluru Heart Declaration, which is a process that has been ongoing for several years from the First Nations in Australia, the government has already foreseen this, but the idea is to carry out specific actions to materialize the idea of the referendum and to incorporate the rights of Indigenous peoples in the Constitution. The racial discrimination is still present in the Australian society. In the face of this phenomena, some still need to recognize that the discrimination in the past, nor has it addressed the inequalities, disadvantages, and discrimination suffered by Indigenous people in Australia in the present or the First Nations. Shortly in the UPR of 2015, the government expressed its support for the calling its support Indigenous institutions such as the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. You must honor that commitment. Likewise, we invite the Australian government to amend the Aboriginal Title Act to include free, prior, and informed consent, removing the power forcibly taken land subject to the Aboriginal title and to extinguish the rights derived from such titles. So it should be abolished, and it should also include indemnification regardless of the date of extinction. In relation to the development projects in the Indigenous areas, it is recommended that the Australian government consider suspending them until the suspension of such projects to have the aspects of this at an international level, to have an environmental aspect and a social cultural, to have this impact for the Aboriginal conventions. They will continue with the free consent. Moreover, in the Bringing Them Home report on stolen children, it is concluded that the forced transfers of Indigenous children had been genocidal in nature and had constituted a crime against humanity for which reparation should be offered under international law. Due to this serious situation, it is recommended to carry out a real audit on the historical wrongs committed against Indigenous peoples, as well as to establish a national reparation mechanism which includes compensation plans for the victims of the stolen generation. In the heart of Uluru Declaration of 2017, it is proposed that a Makarrata Commission supervise a process of agreement and search for the truth between the government and the Indigenous peoples in relations to these events. Now going to Canada, we must highlight that Canada has not signed the ILO Convention number 169 on Indigenous and tribal peoples. So we urge the Canadian government to put an end to the violation of the human rights of ethnic, minority, and vulnerable groups, eradicating racist and discriminatory practice of organization in public entities through a comprehensive plan to combat all forms of discrimination against Indigenous people and try to comply with the rights of the First Nations. And they should be doing it in a comprehensive plan to share all this together and guarantee the rights. In this regard, all discriminatory implication of the Indigenous Affairs Acts in 1876 must also be abolished. In order to eliminate the historical discrimination still persists, it's also recommended to adopt effective legal measures to combat violence against women, especially Indigenous women, bring those responsible to justice, as well as to organize and follow up by the visit of the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples, specifically those that disappeared and were assassinated. This is another report that has to have the audit of the people. In 1997, the territory chiefs, Wetz and Gitsa, won a landmark ruling in the Supreme Court of Canada with all the 9 justices upholding the existence of the post-Confederation Aboriginal title. This jurisprudence must be extended to all other Indigenous peoples as a state policy that guarantees the human rights of the First Nations. Moreover, as in the case of Australia, in the case of energy mining, we urge the Canadian government to suspend these governments to have a previous impact that I explained related to participating in this, followed by different processes of prior and informed consent. Now going to the United States, the U.S. is urged to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as committed in the second cycle of the UPR. And it is recommended that they incorporate provisions into national policies and laws. During the second cycle of the UPR, the U.S. was recommended to sign the ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and tribal peoples, and it has not yet done so. In the United States, there are 400 indigenous tribes that are not been recognized at a federal level, so they exist in a context of lack of legal sanction for their way of life. This fact constitutes a threat to their existence and culture. Let's remember that international level, it's the recognition of self-determination that in this case is not being complied with. When the government does not recognize these indigenous populations, they are denying them the right to existence. So we urge them to recognize and apply the recognition right of the indigenous peoples to be applied and to have their existence recognized. We also recommend the United States to ensure that the indigenous peoples participate in the decision-making on all matters that affect them by adopting laws to enforce consultation with local indigenous communities in relation to all projects that they have repercussions with traditional territories. This is contemplated in the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. In order to fully guarantee the territorial legal security of the First Nations, it is recommended to the federal government of the United States that its current laws for the protection of the sacred and cultural place of Indigenous people reflect their vision on definition of sacredness, and to ensure that the indigenous peoples have full access to redress for violations perpetrated on and against their lands and territories. To fully ensure the legal certainty for First Nation, it is recommended that the U.S. conduct a thorough environmental impact assessment of infrastructure projects, requiring a full environmental and social cultural impact statement for projects of extractive industry that affect indigenous peoples, regardless of the legal status of the land. This is regarding the law of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And lastly, it's very important regarding the civil political rights, the United States must internally recognize in a global and comprehensive manner the economic and social rights of the First Nations and the guarantees established in the respective internal protocols with the social and cultural rights. So we believe that these are the minimum demands to guarantee the existence and survival of the nations, of the First Nations, both in Australia, Canada, and the United States. We have to do a minimum effort to have these First Nations. And these is with the application of international level with the standards established in human rights, in collective rights of the indigenous peoples. So these are the minimum recommendations that we have at hand. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Eric Gutierrez was a representative of Sures for his exposition and for the findings that he has given us in the development of this event. And like this, we finish with the panelist cycle within the framework of this side event of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And now we go to the questions and answers sessions and reflection session. And we are pleased to present here to the excellent ambassador of the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, DPRK, Ambassador Tai Song-hang. Excellency, welcome.
It is very interesting event. First of all, I would like to thank for China and Venezuela mission for organizing this important event. It's because I think this event is very important. It's because now they are talking about the more present things, not the past things. So genocide of indigenous people is past one, but it should be, brought to today's discussion and the present discussion. I also appreciate the panelists for their presentation, which were very detailed with a historical fact. Through video, which you have seen just before, also we came to know more clearly how barbarously, how brutally, how crucially the genocide, the America, Canada and Australia, genocided the indigenous people in that land. First, I would like to express my profound sympathy and solidarity to the indigenous peoples. We share with you what your support in the past. The US, Canada, and Australia are not their own country. They robbed the country from indigenous peoples. For robbing the land, for making their country, they oppressed indigenous people, systematically, genocide the people, and then forced them to remote areas. Even nowadays, indigenous peoples are deprived their all basic human rights. Right to food, right to water, right to house, even the opportunity of education and job. They lost everything. It is so pity. What is ironic and ridiculous nowadays is that those countries, US, Canada, Australia, in the past they pretended, and still they are pretending as an advocate of human rights. And then they act like the judge or jury in international arena which deal with the human rights issues. I think this shouldn't be tolerated. The history cannot be erased or forgotten or disappear if someone tried to do so. Their barbarous, genocide crimes will be worst history in human being. I think the genocide of indigenous people by America, Canada, Australia should be brought to the International Criminal Court for further investigation. And at least those barbarous crimes should be recorded in ICCC, International Criminal Court. We cannot no longer be silenced such horrible, barbarous, and brutal genocides, although it was the past ones. So I really enjoyed this very important side event, which gives me a lot of knowledge how badly, how brutally America, Canada, and Australia genocided the indigenous people. Although now they try to improve something, but past history is history. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, excelentísimo embajador.
Thank you, Excellency. We are honored by your participation and presence in this event in a collaborative manner, as you did as well in the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. And now we would like to give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. Angosan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. If so, please confirm somehow.
Sí, podemos escuchar, pero no podemos verte.
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Okay, let me try. Not sure, let me try once again. Can you see me now? Perfect, perfect. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thank you for giving me the floor. Sorry for technical glitch. At the outset, let me thank the permanent missions of China and Venezuela for convening the side event on systematic violations of indigenous peoples' human rights by US, Canada, and Australia. We found the documentary video and presentations by the panelists very informative, yet disturbing. We're concerned that the respective governments failed to address the existing violations, which contribute to the growing climate of impunity, leading to recurrence of violations. In the US, the long-standing inequalities in public funding, infrastructure, as well as lack of or inadequate access to healthcare, education, stable housing, healthy foods, and insurance coverage have contributed to health disparities that put indigenous peoples at higher risk for severe COVID-19 associated illness. The COVID-19 pandemic hit native communities especially hard, which forced some reservations to protect themselves by trying to control access of people from outside. However, the pandemic did not suspend government's efforts in other areas, especially natural resources extraction and transportation, without consent of respective indigenous peoples. In Canada, residential schools were part of colonial policy to eradicate indigenous cultures, languages, and communities, as it was already mentioned today. While the law school closed in 1996, intergenerational trauma, ongoing harms, and discriminatory practices continue nowadays. The remains of 215 indigenous children were found on the grounds of the former Kamplus Indian Residential School in British Columbia. Remains have also been found on the grounds of the former Brandon Indian Residential School in Manitoba, and it is expected that new sites with the remains of indigenous people continue to be detected across Canada. Despite Canada's efforts, including through the adoption of Action Plan on Reconciliation with Indigenous Peoples in response to the ongoing murdered and missing Indigenous women crisis in Canada, its implementation and realization of the recommendations of the 2019 inquiry are delayed. Canada's remote Indigenous communities have been particularly vulnerable to the global COVID-19 pandemic. First Nations people living on reserves have been experiencing COVID-19 at a rate 40% higher than the general Canadian public. This exacerbated disproportionate health impacts on Indigenous peoples that include vulnerabilities to diabetes, obesity, asthma, and arthritis, all of which place individuals at greater risk of morbidity when exposed to COVID-19. Recent cases across country have revealed the prominent racism within its healthcare system, which clearly reveals the long troubled relationship between Canadian public healthcare institutions and Indigenous patients. In Australia, the health situation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is particularly alarming. The gap in mortality rates remains 1.7 times higher than for non-Indigenous people. Mortality among children 0 to 4 years old is 1.9 times higher than for non-Indigenous children. Aboriginal people and the Australian Torres Strait Islanders also have higher rates of chronic diseases, and the health rate from diabetes is 12 times higher than the rate of non-Indigenous Australians. Suicide has become a major cause of premature mortality for Indigenous people. And in 2014, it was the 5th case of death among Indigenous peoples. Indigenous children and youth are particularly vulnerable. Those between the ages of 15 and 24 are 5 times more likely to commit suicide than their non-Indigenous peers, and 30% of the country's youth suicides are Aboriginal. Aboriginal children account for 80% of suicides in the nation of children 12 years old and younger. The Aboriginal people in Australia are the most imprisoned people on earth. The overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons is obvious. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people made up 29% of the prison population, being only 5% of the total population. Almost 3 in 5 children in detention were Indigenous. As of December 2020, there had been at least 441 deaths of Aboriginal people in custody without anyone being convicted for those deaths, an increase of 345% in 30 years. Mr. Moderator, dear colleagues, participants, this is a short and obviously non-exhaustive list of serious human rights violations experienced by Indigenous people. We strongly believe that governments of mentioned states need to comply with their international human rights obligations and commitments and ensure that Indigenous people enjoy their human rights. I thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a la representante.
Thank you for the representative of the permanent mission of the Russian Federation, Mr. Kusal, for your intervention that you have shared with us today in this important event. And continuing with the people that have requested the floor, we would like to invite the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Mehdi Alabari, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Let me also thank China and Venezuela for organizing this side event and for all the useful information provided by distinguished panelists. Serious human rights violation against the indigenous people in United States, Canada, and Australia are matter of great concern. As has been pointed out by previous speakers, these violations are not something belong to the past history, but they are continued systematic violation in these countries. Indigenous people around the world still suffers from the consequences of the historical legacies of colonialization in their territories. They face discrimination because they have distinct culture, identities, and ways of life, and are disproportionately affected by poverty and marginalization. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People indicates that indigenous peoples and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples and individuals and have the right not to be discriminated against in the exercise of their rights. Historically, the indigenous people in Canada were living under discrimination by Canadian authorities and being robbed of their land, killed, and buried secretly in eradicated their culture. These facts were documented in the reports of expert mechanism on rights of indigenous people in the 48th session of Human Rights Council last September. The international community shocked over revealing news regarding unearthing remains of hundreds of indigenous people, including children, at the sites of several former residential schools in Canada. Such atrocities and responsibility of the perpetrators should never be forgotten, nor shall the realization of justice be ignored. While many pointed out to Canada's past role in attempted cultural genocide of its indigenous people, the role of colonial British should not be sidelined. Iran underscores the importance of redress regarding violation of the rights of the indigenous people, which is stipulated in Article 8, 11, and 28 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Muchísimas gracias, representante de la misión permanente de la República
Thank
Islámica.
you for the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for your participation in this important event within the framework of the Human Rights Council in the United Nations. And we want to give the floor to the president of the international organization, AIDS, David Lopez. You have the floor. Thank you very much, everyone. Panelists, missions, diplomatic missions, and to all of those that are following us on Facebook Live. I am happy to co-sponsor this in this side event in company of the solidarity process in Venezuela. It's very important to have a position in a defense in the matters of human rights of the autochthonous people in Latin America, as we have done so in Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and in various other places in Latin America, but it's also in the peoples that are in the continent. And there's a lot of places they continue to clean their images and to have a democracy that they actually hide through. The panelists explained it before, the rights of indigenous peoples in these countries are there. This is why we demand the government of Canada, United States, and Australia to respect the international conventions on the rights of indigenous peoples and to recognize their autonomy as well, so that they can benefit for and enjoy their human rights as it's part of humanitarian international law. And we want to remember that in the previous Human Rights Council, we did a report of the situation of indigenous peoples in Canada, which we admire to have there. And you can see it in the media or through IDIS. And you can also see in depth what has been set out by the panelist of Canada, by Mr. Seth. And we will invite to continue holding these sorts of site events to have these characteristics, to dwell not only on the situation of Canada, the United States, and Australia, and other countries where there are autochthonous peoples and where they require the help of human rights. Without further ado, I would like to thank the permanent mission of the People's Republic of China, the permanent mission of Bavarian Republic of Venezuela to being an initiative of this and for being co-sponsors of this event. And we remember that for March 28, we will have a side event or the North America military interventionism, where we have a lot of things to say. Thank you all for your presence and thank you for being here with us. Thank you very much, David, President of the IDS. We would like to now invite the coordinator of the National Indigenous Council, Venezuela, Noeli Pocaterra. You have the floor, companion. We can't hear her. Noeli, are you there? We can't hear you. Are you here?
Bueno, parece que se ha desconectado. Igualmente,
well,
sí.
it seems that she doesn't have an audio. Maybe we can come back. Well, we want to invite Mr. Carlos Soler, who is from the General Castillo of the Pemon people from Venezuela. Carlos, welcome.
Carlos, ¿nos escuchas?
Carlos, can you hear us?
Aló, ¿me escuchan?
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Hello to the mission and to all the panelists of the People's Republic of China and of Venezuela, from the General Caciques, people of the Grand Sabana. We make reference to everything said in the violation of the indigenous people from the United States and Canada. It's important to highlight that the difference of the countries that promote the violence and vision of the human rights and indigenous peoples, our country is a country that has advanced in the defense of this. But to give the participation, the political participation of the indigenous people. That to have the human rights in those countries that they want to interfere in. The authorities, we have seen the double standards of the governments that promote war in other countries. And we see the violation of indigenous peoples in other countries, such in the case of Australia, United States, and Canada. We are well aware that our government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has given the necessary support to have the necessary cooperation with our country, with the subject that here at hand we have a greater improvement. And in our country can be one of the countries that provide to the defense of indigenous people. We continue to work from the General Council of Caciques to continue with these rights and to be referenced in all of these countries in the world, to tell the world that the indigenous peoples, together we can comply with this. And in this point, we have Noeli who's there, and I'm sure that she will give us some insight. We would like to thank you from the legitimate authorities of the Pemon people, from our communities in the country. We are working together to see this and be solidary to this, that this has been from Canada, from the United States, and that we can see the necessary solidarity of us and to have this share amongst us, to share our lands from the Patagonia to the whole America, to the whole world where the original peoples are. There is no violation of human rights that is overseen, that goes beyond war, and the consequences of these cannot be looked aside. We want to thank all the countries, the Russian Federation, China, and all the other countries that fight for the rights of indigenous peoples, and tell them that at home they have a lot to do. But they don't want to, the governments don't want to see the problems that lie at home. They want to look beyond to alleviate these problems that are home. And we want to thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. Thank you, Carlos, for being here present. Now we're going to try again with Noeli Pocaterra. Let's remember that she's a general coordinator of the National Indigenous Council of Venezuela. Noeli, can we hear you? I think there's a problem with her audio. We can't seem to hear. We can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Allí tienes el teléfono, el micrófono apagado.
Yes, you have the microphone off. Can you turn on the microphone? Let's see if we can hear you.
No, no se escucha.
No, we can't hear you. I'm sorry, we can't hear your audio.
Bueno, en este caso es difícil. No sé si.
So it's very hard in this case. I don't know if she can try again to see, turn off the microphone, turn it on. Let's remember that this is a live event. These technical difficulties are always present. Let's try once more to see if we manage to have her intervention. No, we can't manage to hear her. So in this case, I invite Noemi Pocaterra to send us her intervention, whether it be through a video or in a written form, so that we may have your valuable intervention. We know that it's part of the technical difficulties. And just to finish off this event, we would like to thank the presence of the various panelists here present. Thank the permanent missions of the organizing this event, the permanent mission of the People's Republic of China, to the permanent mission of the Bavarian Republic of Venezuela, and the civil society organizations that have helped in the preparation, organization, development of this event, IDIS, and the Committee of International Solidarity, to representatives of the permanent missions that we have had the chance to listen to today, of the People's Republic or the Democratic Republic of Iran, the DPRK, the Russian Federation, and the various representations of the indigenous peoples. We thank them. We will continue from the organizations and from the various aspects fighting for the defense of human rights of indigenous people. We have no further thing to say but to say goodbye and thank you for your presence and participation. Thank you very much.